Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into one of the most desperate, unsettling chapters of World War II, the rise of Japan's kamikaze pilots. But before we get to the pilots themselves, we have to understand the world that created them. So, picture Japan in late 1944. On paper, it's still an empire, but in reality, it's a collapsing star. What once seemed like unstoppable expansion across Asia and the Pacific has been ground down by one brutal, strategic fact: the Allies are closing in. Let's start with the geography. Japan's empire was massively overextended. It had spread its forces thin across countless islands, from Burma to the Philippines. But now, that web is snapping. The United States has launched its island-hopping campaign, cutting off supply lines and clawing back territory step by step. And each step gets them closer to Japan itself. But it's not just territory. Japan's once feared navy has taken crushing hits. The battles of Midway and Leyte Gulf weren't just losses, they were strategic earthquakes. Aircraft carriers sunk, destroyers blown apart. The ability to control the seas, the very thing that gave Japan its reach, was slipping through its fingers. And if that weren't enough, the homeland itself was breaking. Fuel was running dry. Factories were bombed into silence. Infrastructure, roads, rails, refineries, was crumbling. The military machine needed to fight a modern war. Japan didn't have it anymore. And yet, this is the most important part: Japan did not surrender. Why? Because the war wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, ideological. The Bushido Code, inherited from the samurai, told soldiers that death was preferable to dishonor. Shinto nationalism taught citizens that the emperor was divine, and that meant obeying him, even to the point of death, wasn't just patriotic, it was sacred. So by the end of 1944, Japan wasn't just running out of options. It was running out of reality. That's when the unthinkable became official policy. Now let's talk about what happens when a nation turns desperation into doctrine. In October of 1944, Japan did something no major military power had ever done before. It created formal suicide units. Not rogue individuals, not last resort volunteers, but state-organized squadrons with one mission: crash into enemy ships and die doing it. These were the first kamikaze units, and they were deployed during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a last-ditch effort to stop the American advance into the Philippines. But who flew these planes? Teenagers. In many cases, boys who had barely finished school. Inexperienced pilots who were taught just enough to take off, steer, and hit a target. Landing wasn't part of the training, because they weren't expected to come back. This wasn't a spontaneous groundswell of nationalism. This was military planning. This was command-level decision-making. And it wasn't optional. The leaders framed it as duty, not just to the country, but to morality itself. Sacrificing yourself became proof of loyalty, proof of character. It was pitched as noble, holy. But make no mistake, this wasn't about individual courage. It was about systemic control. You see, the idea of the kamikaze wasn't born out of strategy, it was born out of collapse. Japan could no longer match American industrial output. It couldn't win with conventional tactics. So instead, it turned human lives into its last remaining weapon. And once that idea took hold, it didn't stay confined to a few missions. Kamikaze became policy, an institutional doctrine, a military strategy, written into orders, backed by bureaucracy, and embedded into the fabric of wartime Japan. It was no longer "you may," it was "you must." So how do you convince thousands of young men to give their lives on command? You don't just tell them, you build the world around them to make anything else unthinkable. In wartime Japan, that world began in the classroom. The education system was restructured to glorify sacrifice. Textbooks were rewritten. Stories praised those who gave their lives for the emperor. Teachers became ideological gatekeepers, not educators. Loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was a curriculum standard. And what if someone had second thoughts? What if a student questioned this path? They didn't speak up, because punishment didn't have to be loud to be effective. A quiet reassignment, a whisper, a look. Social ostracism did the work of a firing squad. Silence became survival, and in silence, dissent disappeared. Meanwhile, propaganda filled every channel. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, posters. Everywhere you looked, you saw death reframed as glory. Kamikaze pilots were called heroes, not victims of circumstance, not conscripts of a desperate regime. Heroes. The emperor was depicted as divine, literally a god walking the earth. So obedience wasn't just national, it was spiritual. Disobedience wasn't just defiance, it was heresy. And the most chilling part? This all started to feel normal. That's the power of ideological normalization. When enough people believe the story, it becomes the truth. When the system repeats a message long enough, that message becomes a moral law. Suicide, in this world, was not a tragedy. It was a rational outcome, an expected step, a calculated sacrifice engineered by a state that no longer needed individuals, it needed symbols. And it got them. Let's get tactical for a moment. Did these kamikaze attacks actually work? Well, yes and no. In the beginning, the impact was terrifying. Imagine being a sailor on a US Navy ship in 1944. You look up and see a plane diving straight at you. No evasive maneuvering, no warning, just raw intent and explosive payload. The initial shock value was enormous. Ships were sunk, crews were killed, morale was shaken. There's something uniquely horrifying about an enemy who's not trying to survive. But war evolves fast. The Allies quickly adapted. Radar technology improved. Flak cannons got more accurate. Combat air patrols formed layers of defense. Suddenly, the kamikaze strategy wasn't a surprise anymore. It was a known threat with a counter-strategy. And while America adapted, Japan fell deeper into exhaustion. The country simply didn't have the industrial capacity to replace what it was losing. Every kamikaze pilot was also one fewer future instructor. Every crashed plane was a plane that couldn't be built again. The resource pool was shrinking fast. By the time 1945 rolled around, kamikaze missions had lost most of their strategic effectiveness. But they didn't stop. Why? Because at that point, they weren't about strategy anymore. They were about symbolism. Japan kept launching them not because they worked, but because they were dramatic, defiant. They projected the illusion of power, even as the empire crumbled behind the curtain. And that's where we see the cost of confusing symbolism with strategy. The more Japan leaned into kamikaze missions, the more it burned through the very resources, human and material, it needed to survive. A short-term shock, a long-term suicide. When the war ended, Japan didn't just lose its empire, it lost its illusion. For years, the nation had wrapped death in the language of honor. Pilots who crashed into ships were hailed as martyrs. But once the war was over, that narrative began to crack, and people started asking dangerous questions. What had they really died for? In the quiet years after 1945, survivors, both civilian and military, had to reckon with the system that demanded their obedience. A system that praised loyalty above logic, that framed coercion as courage, that demanded unquestioning sacrifice in the name of a god-emperor who, once the war ended, renounced his own divinity. That was a seismic shift. Imagine growing up believing your leader was sacred, only to hear him, on the radio, say he's not. That moment shattered more than belief. It shattered identity. Former kamikaze pilots who had been saved by chance or mechanical failure often lived with deep shame, not because they failed their mission, but because they survived a lie. They were trained to see death as the pinnacle of patriotism, and then left to process the truth alone. And here's the harder question. Was it really bravery if they never had a choice? When sacrifice is engineered by a system that suppresses dissent, twists morality, and eliminates alternatives, is it still heroic? Or is it just tragic? Post-war Japan had to rebuild not only its economy, but its ethics. It had to re-educate its children, re-examine its heroes, and reimagine a national story that didn't require bodies to keep it alive. The kamikaze legacy is not just about what happened during the war. It's about how a society remembers, or forgets, what it asked of its own people. So, was kamikaze warfare just a grim artifact of World War II? Not exactly, because the blueprint didn't disappear. It mutated, reappeared, adapted. In the decades that followed, suicide attacks emerged in new forms, different ideologies, different geographies, same structure. From radical insurgent groups to terrorist cells, we've seen this tactic resurface again and again. Why? Because the system works, not strategically, but psychologically. You don't need a massive army when you can weaponize belief. You don't need tanks when you can manufacture martyrs. And that's exactly what modern militant movements have done. They've repackaged death, not as failure, but as a mission completed, a sacred transaction, a ticket to paradise. Sound familiar? The logic behind the kamikaze, sacrifice for a higher power, glorification of death, erasure of individual agency, isn't unique to Japan. It's a pattern, a recurring algorithm that centralized ideologies tap into when power is slipping and desperation sets in. These tactics often thrive under authoritarian structures. When a single voice controls the narrative, and alternatives are not just ignored but erased, you can create a moral universe where suicide isn't just allowed, it's exalted. And here's the chilling part. The people who die in these systems aren't always radicals from the start. Many are young, poor, disillusioned, idealistic, or simply convinced they have no other option. Which means the real weapon isn't the bomb or the plane, it's the narrative, the story they're fed from the moment they can understand language. From Imperial Japan to modern-day militancy, the echoes are clear. Different faces, different flags, same machinery. Let's step back. This isn't just a story about kamikaze pilots, or even about Japan. It's about what happens when systems, political, ideological, even spiritual, demand sacrifice as proof of loyalty. Because once a society starts rewarding death more than life, it becomes very hard to say no. This is the danger of centralized control, not just in war, but in how truth is shaped. When governments, militaries, or movements define morality from the top down, individual judgment becomes a threat. Independent thought becomes treason, and people, especially the young, are turned into symbols before they ever become adults. That's why history matters, not just to remember the facts, but to recognize the patterns. Kamikaze warfare wasn't born from a single maniacal decision. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had no room left for nuance, no room for dissent, and no plan for failure. So here's the question: when a system asks you to give your life, who really benefits? That's a question worth asking, not just about the past, but about the present. Thanks for watching. If you found this episode thought-provoking, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And check out the podcast version of this episode, links in the description. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys peeling back the layers of history, questioning the official version, and connecting the dots the textbooks skip, stick around. We've got a lot more stories to uncover here at Truth Behind History.